So
That's correct.
first off, I want to introduce, we have a new member, Carlos Rodriguez. Carlos is a council member from Yorba Linda, and thank you for being here. And want to introduce yourself real quick? Or
Well, good morning. My name is Carlos Rodriguez. I serve on the Yorba Linda City Council. I'm really excited to work alongside you, and it's a collaborative effort, and appreciate all the efforts you guys have made over the years, and hopefully I could help the cause, and I'm looking forward to today's agenda, so thank you.
very good. All right. With that, we'll go ahead and go around the room.
Good morning, Eddie Marquez.
Good morning, Paul Avila, Paul Avila and Associates.
Jeff Blake with the Metal Finishers Association.
Bill Lamar, Executive Director of the California Small Business Alliance.
David Rothbart, Los Angeles County Sanitation Districts.
Lavon Daniel, Danco. Nancy Feldman, Legal.
Fabian Wesson, Public Affairs and Legislative.
Derek Alatorre.
Rachel Arzmendi, City of Sierra Madre and Pace, and thank you for bringing back the cookies.
Julie Valencia, South Coast AQMD staff.
Philip Crabb, South Coast AQMD staff.
Very good. So first are a couple of action items. Anyone have any questions on the March 8th minutes? If there are no questions, I'll look for a motion on the minutes.
Motion to move the item, Mr. Chair.
We'll have a motion and a second. Any opposed? So ordered. One more quick announcement I need to make just before we go on. I'll be leaving a little early. I've got, unfortunately, a funeral to attend at 1 o'clock, so I'll be stepping out probably around 12:15, 12:30. So just if I step out quietly, Derek will take over, and we'll go from there. All right. With that, we have the follow-up and action items. Any questions on the follow-up and action items, or do you have something to announce, Derek? Derek has nothing to announce. Do you have any questions? Apparently not. All right. With that, we'll go on to the first discussion item, the online subscription services. Mark? All right.
Actually, I'll start. Mike Morris, the Planning and Rules Manager, and I'll be handing it off to Mark at the end of my presentation. So just wanted to share with the committee some changes that we're planning for notification when we're doing rule development. So in June of last year, the South Coast AQMD sponsored Senate Bill 1502, which enables us to modernize our communication during rulemaking activities. This would relate to the public notices that we send out for the public workshops and the public hearings. What this Senate bill allows us to do is to utilize emails instead of mail. And in order to do so, we have to update our procedures so that we ensure that people are adequately notified about our rulemaking. So currently what we do in rulemaking is we do have, we mail out to all of our stakeholders and interested parties, and then we send out a notice to all of the newspapers in the 4-county area. We'll be keeping that newspaper notice, but for the emails in the future, we will have a different practice. What we will ultimately attempt to do is have most of our stakeholders notified by email, but we will mail them the notices when they request that they have that mailed instead. Right now, the challenge for us is that we don't have all of the email addresses for the people who need to be notified with respect to the rule. So what we'll be doing as part of this is developing an electronic infrastructure, and this will take some amount of time to get there. What we're hoping to do and what Mark is going to show you is how right now we're collecting email addresses through our website. When we're having future rulemaking where we have all the information for the stakeholders on smaller rulemakings, we'll go ahead and see if they're amenable to having us email the notices and do it that way instead of mailing. But for our larger ones where we're still in the midst of taking care of this, it'll be done by email. Ultimately, we're hoping that we can get this all taken care of in the next several years so that we can go to basically an all email notification process. When we brought this up to our stakeholders, We were asked that we include an opt-in provision for this so that those facilities that prefer to get electronic notification continue to do so. We do need to look at designating some type of responsible person within the facility to make sure that the notifications are going to the right people. And then, of course, we need to allow facilities to be able to receive multiple notifications in case they have several people that are interested in the being notified. So as part of this, and as Mark is going to be showing right now, we're developing this electronic infrastructure. It's an ongoing process, but it will allow us in the future to switch over to email rather than depending on mail. That ideally will present a decent cost savings in how we notify our public. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Mark unless there's some questions that I can answer before
Couple
that.
quick questions here, David.
Sure.
My quick question, as far as if you already are getting emails, do we need to respond and get the email into this new system, or we transfer over existing emails?
So we will be transferring over the existing emails, and in a, as you know, through our rule development process, we email out a lot of the information already. The difficulty is that we don't always know that it's going to the right person, and people leave the organization, and then we're not sure if the email is going once again and getting read. So I think that's some aspect of it that we need to add into this.
Yeah, Mike, maybe this is a Ron Moskowitz question, but when this program is being designed or you're providing input to IT for this, I noticed that you have in your key features allow a facility to change the designated person. When companies change personnel for any number of reasons, voluntary and involuntary, I got to believe that AQMD, notifying AQMD is probably not high on their agenda at HR or something like that. Are you going to have some sort of a reminder or tickler on a regular basis to remind that company or people within that company that if you do have a change in someone to provide them with a new email person?
Excellent suggestion. I think that is something that we need to build into the program. I know that there's some questions about if the notification goes to somebody and there's no response, we're getting a soft bounce, what they call that, that after so many soft bounces that we need to reach back out to that company and say, is this the right person that we should be contacting?
Bill, one of the suggestions I would have as a former IT guy is set up an email box that's notifications for the company that go to multiple people. So that if it's a notification, of a new rulemaking, you may want that to go more than just the one person. And that way, when that person changes, it's going to multiple people already. So it gets caught somewhere. But that's just how I would do it in a company I would be working with. But
I don't want to belabor the point, but in small business or that industry sector, there are any number of businesses where the owner is absent. It might even be in another state, and you have a COO or a CFO or somebody like that out here in Southern California, and somebody else might be somewhere else. So.
Yes,
that's what I was going to suggest is a designated title, not necessarily a person's name, but a designated title. That title stays the same all the time. And then if you send it a name, then they'll let you know that person within that title has changed. But that seems to work for us.
Thank you. So, Mark? Oh, sorry.
Just curious, the number of stakeholders that are currently receiving information, and do you have a timeline of when this transition, the goal would be, and is it a automatic opt-in to getting an email, or can you just clarify that again? Thanks.
So right now, depending on the rule development process, it can go out to a few hundred interested stakeholders, to some of them, including this particular rule, to tens of thousands. I think this one was about 30,000 that we mailed out. So it can be quite sizable. As far as, could you repeat the other two? Sorry.
The goal for timing to make the transition, and then is there for the 30,000 or however many are receiving the notices now, will there be a opt-in to receiving the email, or is it going to automatically happen?
So ideally, we're hoping by about 2022 that we can have this process set up and then have those that want to opt in participating. That was part of the request from our stakeholders when we brought this forward, that we would make it an opt-in so that if there wasn't any action on the part of the facility, they would remain receiving mail notifications until that point.
So hi, Mark Henninger from IT. What I was going to just show you real quickly is the sign-up process for the email subscriptions that we do have in place now. But as Mike said, this is not a whole lot of functionality compared to what's being planned. And we are working together to, at this point, scope out and come up with all the design and requirements that we can implement to meet all those needs. So right now, the way the system works is from our main homepage, there's the sign up menu item and newsletter sign up. When you come here, there are a bunch of different areas of interest that you can sign up to receive emails. So there's general information, plan updates, equipment exchange, incentive programs, permit related, refinery flares is a big one. And then there's all the different rule updates. So for the different rules that are or have been amended and going through amendments or adoption, so anyone can come here and sign up and receive the email notifications associated with these. For the rule updates, these lists of subscribers are then used by planning and rules to send out notifications to and emails. There are some limitations, and it's not as robust as what's actually needed to satisfy the public noticing requirements. So that's why we're working together to come up with a design and a system and implementation to meet all of those needs.
Very good. Any other questions, anyone? Thank you. All right, with that, we'll move on to the update on AB 2766. Carol? Very good.
Good afternoon. I'm Carol Gomez. I'm a Planning and Rules Manager. And I'm going to give you an overview of our 1617 AB 2766 report. The purpose of this report, for those of you that this is new for, is to show the amount of monies that came into this program and then how they were spent and the emission reductions that were obtained from them. As a little bit of background, 2766 was adopted in 1990, and it states that 40% of $4 from the DMV registration funds are to come to the district to be convened out to 162 local governments, in which they're to spend their funds on 11 different mobile emission categories. And the rest of that $4 goes towards the MSRC and towards the district to use for different projects. I have several slides here that have photos of some of the common uses of the funds. So this one right here is for EV infrastructure that was developed in Santa Clarita. We have many of the cities, but there's many others who spend the monies on providing rideshare incentives for their employees so that they can take the bus or van pool. The funds can be used for street paving, and we have a number who use it for street sweeper purchases. Bicycling also is a popular one. The picture on the left every year in Diamond Bar, but we're not the only ones. We have bike to work events. Oh, thank you.
This one keeps falling.
Okay, thanks. That's better? Okay, good. So there's bike to work events. The city of Long Beach, they're very well known for all their bike paths and routes and trails and things. They're very advanced when it comes to the bike stuff. This right here is the City of LA. It's their traffic synchronization system that they have. If you ever have an opportunity to go and have a tour of it, it's very impressive. They call it their ADSAC system. And I'm actually going to talk in a couple of slides some more specifically about this program. So the monies come in. We convene them out on a quarterly basis to the local governments. They spend them on mobile emission projects. They have to every year submit a report to us telling us how they use the funds and their emission reductions. For that, they're provided a software tool that they input their project data, and then the tool calculates the emission reductions. They submit that to us, goes to our board, goes to CARB, and there's an audit function. And it looks like you have a question.
Yes, is there any measurement of the actual air in the area on the emissions reduction, or is this all computer?
It's computer.
Do we
So
ever
it
follow up to see what the real deal is?
Not for these specific projects. I mean, we have air monitors all through our region,
Yeah.
but those wouldn't tell you that the reductions are from this project or from this project. We just know as a whole, all these different programs we do are hopefully making.
As complicated as measuring that is there a sense that you see in the actual monitoring that we are getting results?
Well, the air is getting cleaner.
So we are seeing in the actual monitoring, not the computer, but the actual monitoring, you see the results. Okay.
Until the weather goes bad and you get
Okay, or a fire. Or a
Yeah, or a fire.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, so for the 16-17 year in summary, I mentioned 162 jurisdictions. They received over 22 million. They spent almost 18 million. They funded 359 projects and reduced 134 tons of emissions.
Hey, Carol, why don't you explain to them why it's 16-17 and not 18-19?
Okay, well, it's always behind because they have to, we're on fiscal years, so there's that. And then they submit their reports, and from the time they submit their reports to us and we go through them, it's almost well, it's not quite a year process, but it's amount of time before we can actually do the report. But this one in particular is later than they usually are, because I was going to address this later in a slide, but I'll address it now. This reporting tool that I referred to that they use, CARB has, it's their tool, and they're the ones who update it every year, and every year we give it to the local governments to use, and it'll have the latest factors and all that. Well, it turns out that at CARB, everybody who's ever worked on the 2766 program is retired. So to get them to give us the updated tool for this reporting year was a little challenging, and it took us a lot longer to get it than normally it would. So what we're doing, and this is addressed I think in either the last slide or the second to the last slide, what we're doing is we're actually working with them that we're going to take over responsibility of updating this tool so that we can have it on a quicker basis. And we feel very comfortable with being able to do that. And so that's in process right now. So the attorneys, because of course attorneys get involved, they've written up an agreement, and right now it's going through the signature process. So. Oh, sorry. Didn't mean it like that. Yeah, I forgot about that.
Now, your contracts will be definitely slowed down, okay? After that comment. Question. Do all the cities and the counties have total latitude on what they do with the funds that they receive?
They don't have total latitude. There's 11 categories, and so the funds have to be spent in one of those 11 categories, and all the categories relate to some type of emission reductions. And I'll get to a slide in a few minutes that'll show the different categories. Okay, so this financial summary is broken down by county. The beginning balance refers to funds that carried over that they had received previously and hadn't spent. And then the amounts that they received this year, the amounts they spent. So when you look at the ending balance, this 57.6 million, and the pre-designated, now in this case, pre-designated is projects that the cities are planning to spend the monies on. That's 85%. We've been working very hard to get the local governments to plan on how they're going to spend their monies, not to just have it go into a pot and sit there. So my 85% is the highest percentage we've ever had for the pre-designation. Yes?
Yeah, question, Carol. I noticed that that among the counties that you serve, the 4 different counties, LA receives the largest amount.
Mm-hmm.
Is
right.
Is it by population?
Right, it is by population.
Oh, okay, not by program submitted
No.
or program value or anything like that.
No,
Breaks down even to the cities. So my little city, 35,000, 36,000 residents, we get it's $28,000 a year or something like that. So it's very broken down by population all the way down to the cities.
Right. Yeah, and that's where the pre-designation is also important, because many of the cities are smaller, so they get relatively small amounts of money every year. So to do a project, they may need to save their money up for a number of years before they have enough to fund something. And that's fine. There's no issues with that whatsoever. But we just want to make sure that they're thinking, though, of down the line how they want to spend this. And here's the different categories that they can spend their funds on. The top 3, the alt fuel vehicles, electric vehicles, transportation demand management, and traffic management, of the almost 18 million spent, 12 million was in those 3 categories, and smaller amounts in the other categories. This slide and the next slide show the amount of emission reductions that were calculated for each of these type categories. Transportation demand management, the top one, that one was 56% of all the emission reductions that were obtained from this program. And then it goes on down from there. And this slide continues on with that. There's a couple categories, public education, for example, where there's allowable projects, but there's no way to calculate emission reductions.
I have another question.
Sure.
Has any of this money, or will, and is it planned that any of this money will be used for AB 617 purposes?
Not directly. If 617 was to promote some projects that fell within these categories, they certainly could. So we wouldn't oppose that. So it just needs to make sure it hits within the categories. I know that there's some discussion right now in San Bernardino about some buses that are CNG, and the community wants them to be electric. So Omnitrans does not receive any of these funds, but if the city or county of San Bernardino wanted to give Omnitrans some monies towards electric buses, just for example, they would be allowed to. So it just kind of depends on what type projects and where the money's, like, who has jurisdiction. Okay, so this slide is a really important slide. Look at the third column over, emission reductions. This is historically what we've been getting. You could see for the previous several years, it's been roughly 6,000 tons a year. And then for 16-17, you see 134. So what happened? So I can explain that. So that ADSAC program for the city of LA, the street synchronization program I showed you a few slides back, we had every year since we've been doing this report, we always called out that project in the report because that was the only project that did not use the reporting tool that I've referenced. They had gotten approval from CARB to use a tool called the Winfrey method. And staff had always questioned the accuracy of this Winfrey method, but because it was approved by CARB and because this is a non-SIP approved program, it was just, we let it go. But last year, our mobile source committee asked staff to take a deeper look at it. So, just a little bit of background first about
Carol,
ADSAC.
before you move on, real quick question
sure.
on the previous slide. As far as the math, I mean, there's pretty large numbers. Even you tons per day, it's a big number. And from the previous slide, I don't know if this is correct to say maybe a third of it is in NOx. I don't know if that's correct or not. I'm just trying to get my head around the numbers in tons per day.
Yeah,
That's a lot of
was
reductions.
this one right here. Yeah, it is a lot of reduction. And remember that most of the reductions, or 56%, are coming from the transportation demand management side. So
Right.
it's coming from vehicles.
So it's a big number.
Yeah.
And you said this is not in the SIP. And is that because they're not meeting the criteria of being permanent?
Because there's a number of reasons for it not being in the SIP. Some of these projects are claimed separately through other projects, so we don't want to double count, so there's that issue. Some of these are funding reductions from Rule 2202, and Rule 2202 is not SIP approved for a number of different reasons. For example, for one of them, but there's several, is that employers are allowed to come to us and say, okay, we have a transportation method of reducing emissions that's not in your rule, and we'll review it, and if we think it's appropriate, we'll do a protocol for it. Like we, a year or so ago, wrote a new protocol for EV infrastructure. But because that leaves it open to people can come to us with ideas, CARB doesn't like that, or the EPA, I should say, doesn't like that. They want to know for sure, what kind of projects are going to be approved.
And it's just a conversation with Philip Fine the other day as far as we got to really find ways to get reductions. And, if there's a way to get credits generated from mobile sources to help with the reclaim transition, things like that. And I don't know if the history on this, since you have such a long history, showing consistent reductions, if this would help substantiate it, could be used for some type of SIP credit or a credit-driven process, mobile to stationary source.
Yeah, but I know we have gone through the process of trying to get at least Rule 2202, since a lot of these emissions are going towards that, SIP approved, and we have not been successful to date. Yes?
Sorry, back to the history of emissions, and given that the 16-17 you changed the, hello. Back to the slide of the history of emissions and understanding that 16-17 you changed the methodology of how to calculate it. Is there still an expectation that if you were going to look back at the 4 previous years that there would be an increase in the emissions reduced? Are we looking at it being about the same? And I don't know if the calculation was done.
I'm not quite sure if I understand your question, but in our reports that we've done, the previous ones, not only did we call out the ADSAC, but we also called out what the emission reductions would have been without using that program. So does that get to your answer or your question?
Yes, but the question is it about the same? Is it an increase in the reduction? How does it compare to the previous years if you had pulled out those numbers and were comparing
I see what you're saying. The reductions this project deals with light duty, medium, and heavy duty. So the light-duty emissions are getting cleaner every year, so the amount of emission reductions for those are going down. We still get very good reductions, though, from the medium and heavy-duty part. So I would need to go back. Off the top of my head, I don't quite remember, but we're probably talking something close. Okay, so getting back to ADSAC. Let's see, is this the slide? Yes. Okay, so that ADSAC program was originally developed for the 1984 Olympics. And then in the 2000-2001 fiscal year, they updated it using 2766 funds. And at that time, that's when they got approval from CARB to use the Winfrey method for their emission calculations. And so that program had been accounting for 90% of all our emission reductions. So staff, there was a number of us who met with the City of LA staff. Actually, this was over a period of times. It was numerous meetings, conference calls, et cetera. And what we ended up all agreeing to was that the emission factors needed to be updated. They needed to be incorporating the latest road segment lengths and real-time speed and traffic volumes. So with a combination of putting all those in and with newer vehicles, it greatly reduced the amount of emissions that are calculated to be reported. But the good news, though, is that now staff feels very confident that the amount of emission reductions we're now reporting are accurate. Yeah, so we feel good about it. So for this program, they're allowed to use other funds of money to go along with the 2766 funds, so they can leverage those. It goes along very well with the MSRC programs, and some of the COGS the local governments will give monies to the COGS to use for regional emission programs, like CVEG, for example, their street sweeping program. For outreach, we hold about 12 meetings, or not meetings, training classes a year where the local governments come and we teach them the correct project usage. We also teach them how to use this reporting tool, answer all their questions. My staff is on the phone or emails every day with local governments on the correct use of the funds, about how they calculate emissions, whether or not a project qualifies or not. We get a lot of questions on whether or not a project qualifies to be used for this program. And then we also do COG briefings and other things like that. So for work in progress, there's a resource guide that goes along with this program that gives examples in each of those 11 categories of what the funds can be spent on, but it's several years old. So we're working on updating it, putting in new examples. And then we're also going to add some examples that the funds are not to be used for. And then that CARB collaboration, that's what I was talking about a few minutes ago, where we're working with them to take over the administration of the software tool. And with that, I'll answer any additional questions.
Carlos?
Just wanted to clarify on the slide 15 that talks about the emission reductions for 16 and 17. So because of the adjustment on the methodology on the ADSAC, is that pretty much the new norm that we're going to be seeing moving forward, is kind of the substantial reduction from 15 to 16 and 16 and 17? It's no longer going to be in the thousands, but
right. This will be the new norm.
Okay. And then also for there was a slide that highlighted the percentage. Let's see. Slide 14. Slide 14 highlights projects quantified. 61% of the total. Generally speaking, what's the threshold of a goal? Would the 60 percentile be what is being aimed for, or is that right about what's expected? Is it below the the ideal? And just can you give some context as to how the performance of the use of funds is going?
Hold on a second. I can't really see that very well, so I have to pull up my slide here. So I can
So
see
it's
what the numbers
slide
are.
14. I see some are 95% quantifiable, and then there's others, public education is 0. So it's kind of understandable how do you quantify public education, but there's others that are higher. Traffic management's 42%.
Oh, yeah.
So there's a range there, but it all kind of goes to 61%. Is that generally where we're hitting the mark on 61%, or would there be an ideal higher number? Or?
For the number of projects that are quantified, we always, in working with the local governments, we try as much as possible to push the quantified projects, because obviously we want projects that are going to obtain emission reductions versus ones that don't. So that the 61% stays probably more or less about the same, but we always, that is something that we can't, like a public education, we can't tell a local government they cannot spend their money on that. We can, and we do have conversations with them on, you're allowed to spend your money on that, but we would really instead try to encourage you to spend it on purchasing new vehicles or whatever, something like that. But there's only so much that we can do as far as pushing.
Are those different categories legislatively set up, or so are those changeable, or were they set up by the board at some point?
They were set up with the original legislation. Those 11 categories.
So we're stuck with that then. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. Not all of us think we can just go change the legislation. Derek thinks he needs to go get it changed, but okay. Paul? That's so easy.
Well, I have an easy one.
Okay.
Just in under a paragraph or two, why was the Winfrey method not accepted or chose another methodology?
You mean back in 2000
Yeah.
or 2001?
According to your sheet here on page 8, without going into deep detail, the Winfrey method was, I guess, second shelved, for lack of better terms.
So your question is why they use the Winfrey method in the beginning instead of our reporting tool?
Yes and no. What's happening to the Winfrey method? I'm sure it was probably implemented upon the initial stage of the project.
Right.
But as the time went along, why was it not, let's say, the calculations weren't precise?
Well, what had happened was when they first implemented the project and got the approval for the Winfrey method, I'm sure that the emission factors they were using at that point were correct, but over time emission factors change and they weren't updating them. And because they had had approval from CARB to do it, they weren't, CARB wasn't making them update them. So it just kind of, as time went, it just got more and more inaccurate.
Go ahead, Greg, or Jeff, sorry.
There you go. Speaking about emission factors, was there a final resolution on the discrepancy or the disagreement between CARB and AQMD on emission factors at the gas pump with the?
That is, that's not under this program, so I couldn't answer that.
Any other questions? Okay.
Just one last question.
Let's go to Levon first.
Please.
She hasn't asked yet.
The cost effectiveness of $25-37 per pound of emission reductions, how does that compare to other programs that AQMD fund or that are funded for emission reductions? Is that considered kind of a normal dollar amount per pound, or because it's significantly more than previous years?
I'm kind of looking towards my staff on that one. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Lane Garcia. I'm program supervisor for this program, recently promoted. How it compares to other programs is difficult to note because we're not keeping track compared to our other AQMD programs. I can tell you that with the loss of that win-free methodology, we lost a very cost-effective tool because of the way it was being evaluated. That program was getting pounds of emission reductions and cost effectiveness that was less than $1 a pound. So with the loss of that methodology, the cost effectiveness also rose in this year. I can tell you that the guidance for this legislation wants us to achieve $10 per pound, and we were doing that. We were below that with the win-free methodology at SAC program. Now, without that, we're above that. But there's nothing in the statute that requires us to meet a specific cost-effectiveness target. It's the same kind of I guess, issue that we have with trying to encourage cities to quantify their projects, but we can't say no to this project if it's not cost effective. One of the kind of consistent problems we have is when a city or a jurisdiction will purchase a vehicle late in the fiscal year and then record 500 miles or 1,000 miles in that vehicle, and it makes the cost effectiveness for that vehicle be upwards of $20,000 a pound, but it's not true or it's not correct because it hasn't seen a lot of usage. Over time, you'll see that cost effectiveness of that one project be increased, but because we record this on a fiscal year cycle, it's kind of masked with that mileage. So we can't require the cities to meet a cost effectiveness level. We can just kind of encourage them to do cost effective projects early in the fiscal year to hit this mark. We want to see the lowest possible, but again, we're constrained by legislation as well. Does that help?
Carlos, go ahead, Carlos.
Just going back to slide 11, just wanted to interpret the remaining undesignated funds of $8.4 million. Is that the cumulative amount across the four-county region of dollars that haven't been earmarked for specific projects?
Yes.
Okay. And is there a list of projects, summaries, or best recommended practices that outline maybe the specifics of those that are percentage of projects quantified at a higher percentage level available to cities so that they can get a sense of greater bang for their buck related to some of those maybe that are in the 92 percentile and or just kind of helping them understand here are some options of what you could utilize those funds for? Is that available to cities?
Yeah, in the report that we put out every year, and it's on our website under the 2766, in the report itself, there's a list of all the projects that were spent or done by all the local governments, and then the cost effectiveness for all those is also on there. So anybody can go through those and look to see what kind of projects had what type of cost effectiveness.
So absent that review, is there any recommendation from SCAG to kind of highlight maybe excerpts from those lists of saying, hey, these really kind of stand apart from the best of the best?
Yeah, in our trainings, those 12 classes roughly that we hold a year, we have several slides that we go through on the preferred projects.
Okay. Just thinking at organizations like OCCOG or others, if that's not already happening, that'd be great information to get. So thank you.
Okay, any other questions? So, Day, I don't know if we lost Supervisor Perez, but I don't see him up there. Supervisor Perez, are you still on? Why don't we try to get him back on before I go to the next one? Not there anymore? Okay. So we'll go to the next item. Next item is a presentation on public nuisance by Carol's best friend, Nancy Feldman.
Carol and I do happen to like each other a great deal. So, no worries there. Even if lawyers are not Carol's favorite people, I know that I am the exception to the rule, so we're all good. I have my lunch. Oh, thank you. Okay, so I think the genesis for this presentation was actually Paul's inquiry several months ago about sriracha, which we had absolutely nothing to do with. Okay, there you go. Yeah, so we actually didn't have anything to do with sriracha. We did a little monitoring in the neighborhood as a courtesy to the community and to the city and to the company even to make sure that there were no toxic emissions, nothing harmful and all that. But that was strictly the city of Irwindale. But nonetheless, we had some vibrant conversation about public nuisance, so we thought we'd just take, and honestly, it's going to be just a very few minutes about public nuisance. I do want to note and apologize. I hadn't seen the printout of the slide presentation in your agenda handout today. Apparently somebody put a light on the, I don't know how that happens with the copier or something. I choose to believe that the PowerPoint presentation was just too brilliant.
That's a good one.
Yes, it's
Good
an
one.
enlightening presentation.
That's a
So
good
you,
one.
you will have to look at the screen rather than follow along with your handout because they're pretty much unreadable. A public nuisance is almost anything that disturbs someone's ability to take advantage of and enjoy their property, or something that actually causes a risk of health impact while they're on their property and damage to business. It was incorporated from the Health and Safety Code into District Rule 402. The rule language mirrors the statutory language almost verbatim, I think verbatim actually. There are some exceptions to our ability to enforce against public nuisance, the most significant being agricultural operations, and that includes the raising of crops and animals. There is an exception for operations that compost green waste derived from agricultural operations, but you might find that we do have several significant prosecutions against green waste facilities, and that's usually because they're mixing in other kinds of waste and composting material that's derived from activities that are not deemed agricultural. As a matter of fact, one of my very favorite enforcement stories, little war stories we accumulate upstairs, had to do with one of our attorneys was prosecuting a green waste facility for causing public nuisance due to odor in the community. Went to court. The owner of the facility shows up and he's got a big brown box with him. Nobody knows what's in it. He got through security though, so at least we know it's nothing dangerous. The judge calls the case and says, before anybody speaks, I want to know, what is that stink in my courtroom? The owner of the facility was so confident that green waste is not an offensive odor that he was going to capitalize on the misperception that it smells like lawn clippings. It's fresh, it's green. And he made the huge mistake of bringing in a box of the stuff, and it so permeated through the courtroom that he told the judge he did not want to proceed with the trial and settled in the hallway. So that was one of our easiest and most fun victories.
Some even bigger issues coming up in the state of Washington. They've passed a law to allow to composting of your loved ones.
Oh yes, I heard about that. Yeah, it actually sounds very intriguing. Yes, let's hope we don't have that. We do, though, the latest and greatest in terms of nuisance cases, and these are agricultural. So we're looking at how do we regulate these operations is cannabis. For those of you who know and those of you who don't, there is a significant odor generated by cannabis. It's described as skunky, and can very much be skunky. So when they have cannabis growing operations that are near schools or public housing projects, housing developments, we do get complaints about it. And we're evaluating, along with attorneys from all across the state at the other air pollution control districts, what to do about that. The big hang up on public nuisance, as far as members of the community are concerned, are that public nuisance, in order to be public, what's the public in public nuisance is considerable number of persons. We will often have people call us because they personally have a problem with a business in their community. They may be located close to an auto body shop, they're smelling paint, or it used to be dry cleaners, but we've gotten away from perks, so it's not such a big deal anymore, or gas stations. And they are impacted themselves, sometimes even a neighbor, pool chemicals, whatever it is causing an odor to them. And they want us, based on our authority to prosecute public nuisance, to take action on their behalf. We cannot do that. That's a private nuisance. People have remedies in the courts. We urge them to follow those. So how do you know when it's a considerable number of persons? Well, there's no magic number. The state has given us zero guidance on that. So what we generally do is give our compliance people something to aim for, which is 6 or more separate households. So not, I have 12 people at my barbecue and they're all complaining about the same odor, so let's do something about that. It has to be separate households, one business, school, or other facility with multiple people there. Yes, Paul?
I'll leave this for you if you want, because I've held this for 2 days just to comment on this.
This meeting?
No, for this reason. With the sriracha plant, and I had asked this a year ago, because what was the exact number, without, variance here or there. We don't have to be precise. But what the newspaper suggests is that 4 people, it tells you right here, it's yours, 4 people or 4 households, okay? Now, half of this is union drama about my eyes are watering and it's just a labor dispute. That's the big picture, but that's not for AQMD. But when it's published like this, and it's come out in other articles, I just don't have the time to save them. And I'd like to have AQMD, not right now, obviously, but say down the road, clarify this and say, okay, if it's 6 individual bodies, great, not a problem. 6 households, great. A block, great, wonderful, because it's going to come back again.
Yeah, we can't.
Yeah.
We can't clarify it.
Oh, okay.
Because it's not a legal standard. This
Okay.
is just a general guideline for enforcement purposes. And we will change them as need be,
Okay.
considering what the case involves. I had a case out in Colton, excuse me, very different. Out in Colton against Union Pacific Railroad. They were pulling trains over onto an emergency siding, which was located literally in people's backyards. I mean, it was really incredible that you have your property line and right past your property line was the siding. And they'd pull trains over into the emergency siding and let the locomotive idle for days at a time. And they did that because the capacity at the Colton train yard was not sufficient for trains to go 2 miles further into the train yard to where they could be held. And they would not turn off the locomotives, because if you turn off a locomotive for more than 4 hours, you have to do an emergency brake test. And that takes a long time. So to save time while they were switching out crews and stopping for other reasons because the yard was at capacity and they had to wait for trains to leave before they could pull that one in, they would just pull off into the siding and let the train run, which means diesel exhaust is flooding the neighborhood. Now, this was a small neighborhood. There were only a few houses on the block that were impacted. maybe not 6, maybe 4 sometimes, maybe 8 sometimes, maybe 3 sometimes. But we determined that that was a public nuisance, and we went after Union Pacific for that. So considerable number of persons is a very fuzzy number, and it depends on the geography. If it's a rural area and you have everyone in the neighborhood and it's only 4 households, but they're all complaining, that's a considerable number of persons. On the other hand, in an urban area where you have multiple dwellings and maybe even multiple family dwellings, you may decide that even 6 or 8 doesn't substantiate a case for public nuisance when nobody else is complaining. So you have geography impacting, and also whether people are willing to come forward and fill out complaint forms so that they can substantiate your case by saying in advance there'll be witnesses. This has become a problem often in environmental justice neighborhoods where people don't necessarily trust the government to act on their behalf appropriately, and so they're not putting their names to pieces of paper. Their citizenship status may be questionable, and they don't want to give you their names, even though we would never follow up on anything like that. Trust can be an issue. Also, we make it very clear to our enforcement staff that they're not to go around soliciting complaints because one vocal person in the neighborhood has started complaining. We have had cases where somebody in an area will decide they don't like the presence of a certain business, and they'll start to recruit people to complain. So we're very careful about things like that. We have a lot of experience, and we try to make sure we only take enforcement action when it is warranted. So how do we do that? Well, we have
Nancy,
basic.
Before you move on, a real quick question about what you're just talking about.
Sure.
Having landfills and wastewater treatment plants, we're very familiar with
I'm
odors
sure.
and trying to make sure we're ahead of the curve. One thing I was curious about is sort of the phenomenon you just talked about as far as if you have a few neighbors that don't like your project, your facility. I've even seen this recently on Facebook for a facility and people who are not trusting of the regulatory agency, and they'll try to get a whole group to try to draw attention to it. As far as enforcement, I understand for legally, as far as prosecuting, that's one thing. But do you know what the policy is as far as enforcement responding to go out and validate?
Yes, and I'm getting, that was a beautiful segue, thank you. You just set me up, you teed me up perfectly. Okay, so we do have enforcement guidelines, and believe me, our people now are so, we have inspectors who are so experienced that we could tell almost from the start whether it's an organized effort against a certain company or project, or whether it's something legitimate. But we treat every complaint really seriously. You can complain by phone, you can complain on our website. The complaint can be anonymous, or you can leave your name. It's obviously better if you leave your name because it allows us to substantiate what's going on and adds a lot of credibility to the complaint. So the inspector, every complaint is responded to. An inspector will go out as quickly as possible. Obviously, that's going to depend on where you are, what hour of the day it is, sometimes what day of the week it is. But the inspector will go out, he will survey the area, he will verify the complaint, he will go to the complainant and say, describe what you smell, do you still smell it now, how strong is it, and see if he or she can verify, yeah, I smell that too. Trace the odor back to the source, and then get back with the complainant and distribute complaint forms if we have received other complaints. If it's odor, it is, yes.
Nancy, I understand the inspector going out, talking to the complainant, if that's possible, personally trying to verify that. But you said, I think you said earlier that an inspector can't go out and I guess, affirmatively try to determine who all is impacted. But they do have to get, what is it,
Yeah.
5 or 6?
We rely on complaints coming in
Okay.
to substantiate for public nuisance.
So when the
The inspector will not go door to door,
Right.
but
So how does he get those
meanwhile, back at
other
headquarters,
corroborating witnesses?
we're emailing the inspector telling him who's complaining. And if an odor is strong enough, we're not getting 1 or 2 complaints. Complaints are coming in, and we will start collecting those. The problem for the facility becomes when it's an ongoing nuisance, when it's not just a one-day event, somebody has an oops at a facility, there's a spill and it gets cleaned up and that's it, or they have a poof of emissions, they fix whatever it is and that's it. But if it's something like landfill odors and they're having a problem with their gas collection system, this is going to go on for a while, and that's when the community gets a little bit more organized, and you'll see people who have actually put together phone trees. And once one calls, you can see you're going to get the 12 or 14 or 30 households calling in rapid succession to complain about odors. So the odors is our driver of nuisance cases. The biggest sources are landfills. And Fabian, you won't believe this, but rendering plants. Fabian had a very unpleasant experience at her first toxic tour where they took her to a rendering plant along with lots of other people, and she got firsthand snootful of what roadkill smells like. And green waste facilities, which do not smell like lawn clippings. Yes, Paul?
It's kind of a delicate question, delicate. Do you get complaints on the homeless migrants, people
No.
moving? No.
Generally not, no.
Okay, because,
They know to go to the city on that.
okay, they go to the city, not.
They go to the cities on
I
that.
see,
They
got
don't,
it.
they don't go to the
Thank
AQMD
you.
on that.
Going back to the response, is it a threshold where the inspectors are not going to go out at night? I mean, it's just like you get one call.
No,
Is it
we will go,
no matter what?
no matter
Someone
what.
will respond.
We will respond. We take great pride in that. You call and complain, we're gonna go out there.
And at least for my facility, my landfills, I don't think are a problem like Sunshine Canyon, just to clarify that. But I think we helped point people in the right direction as far as how to control odors at landfills. But when we do have issues, we try to go to the public saying, please let the facility know, because we have people there.
Yes.
And we could respond, or we have
We
maybe
encourage
more.
that in our enforcement cases. I know the ones that I've had, I will generally meet with the facility and tell them that one of the most productive things they can do is set up a community meeting and be willing to talk to the members of the public who are complaining about them and explain to them what's going on at the facility, what they do there, what's the nature of the emissions, why is there an odor associated with it, what remedial action are they taking. And people can be very reasonable and very patient when they know that you are listening and that you're going to do something about it. So it's very productive to post phone numbers. If you smell anything, if you have a complaint, please call. We do like to be involved in those and to maintain good communication with the facility, because what we don't want to encourage, and we've unfortunately seen it happen, is where the business tries to get their arms around the entire situation and start telling people, don't call the AQMD when you have a problem. Don't tell them you have a complaint. Just tell us. We'll pass it along to them.
And something we've asked enforcement about is, we know we're not going to say cross the line of tell us exactly where the complaint is, but it would be nice if there's somehow that the business could be notified. So if they really are trying to be on top of things, they may not know there's a problem until there's a violation. It'd be nice to know.
Well, we don't often know there's a problem until we can substantiate the violation. We will never give out the names of the complainants to the facility. We will share areas, like this street seems to be having a problem, this
you know, the area opposite the park or whatever has a problem. We don't give out names, and we will never fail to respond. But, you know, we do bring the facility in on the discussion as quickly as possible. I don't know how to do it any
And
earlier.
a good example of that for at least most of our facilities, landfills especially, is we have
Yeah.
weather stations. So we get a complaint into our system, we will have someone go out and they'll check the weather station. And that way it hopefully will eliminate possible situations or narrow it down for us. We'll investigate and then go back to the resident and explain, here's what's going on. If it's a problem, we'll fix it. But if not, here's what we found. And usually that helps. But unless we know about it, we can't really investigate it quickly.
Right. You're generally going to find out about it very early on, even before an NOV is issued, because during the course of the inspection, the inspector is going to visit the facility and say, what's going on? So, you know, that's the first contact. And why are you getting complaints? Oh, yeah, we are. So, you know, you do get involved pretty early. The next most popular public nuisance is dust. That usually happens when there are real estate developments, grading, road construction. Caltrans will often generate lots of dust. They don't like hearing from us. And grinding operations where they're taking care of construction and road waste and stuff like that. And they have these big open facilities and big grinders, and they just let the dust go. So there's all kinds of mitigation measures they can use. We have pretty good penalty authority over nuisance, and in the last few years it was increased somewhat. So there are different levels depending on the level of culpability, you know, whether the facility just had a little accident or actually fails to take corrective measures or just does not care. So, fortunately, we have very few of those. So our most famous nuisance cases is the ongoing problem with Sunshine Canyon. They've been under an order for abatement for, I don't know, 8 years or something, while they upgrade their gas collection system. We seem to have finally gotten a handle on that. The complaints have gone down dramatically over the course of the past few years, and hopefully we can put that in our past. It's pretty much done now, I would say. I'd like to let all of you know that the Aliso Canyon gas leak, we had one notice of violation issued for that of public nuisance. All we had to do was one. That's how awesome a public nuisance NOV, all alone, just one little notice of violation can be. And you know, you all know how far and wide that spread, and all kinds of regulatory agencies got involved, and only very recently did the remaining regulatory authorities settle their case with them. But the private lawsuits persist. No, it was an underground well where the wellhead had cracked and just blew, essentially, and they could not control it, and it was much bigger than the gas company realized. So 4 months of methane, and because it had been an oil field prior to it being a gas storage facility, there were all kinds of nasty components in the emissions. To this day, we're not really sure exactly what was in there. And it was horrendous, and it is not over.
So for that one NOV, was that for
One NOV.
for that one NOV or one NOV for 4 months?
It was one NOV, and we didn't feel the need to go out every day for 4 months and keep papering them. It covered the entire period of time. But people were surprised that that was the only rule violation, because we don't regulate the wells. So they did not violate any AQMD rule but for the prohibition against public nuisance.
I'm curious about sort of the casual odor complaint that's transient, which is, I think, fairly common. And then what's sort of the process where you get to, you know, Sunshine Canyon is probably the most egregious example, but something that's a bad actor that's not, you know, fixing the problem or it hasn't addressed the problem. What's kind of the protocol at that point? You issue an NOV, and then it
Oh,
continues
yes,
happening?
that's a
What
good,
happens?
that's a good question. So you'll see that Sunshine Canyon is a very good example of that. And I wouldn't necessarily call them a bad actor. They just, their gas collection system, I think ultimately everybody agreed that was the problem. The things that they did to remediate odors at that landfill are things that have not been done at other landfills, and so hopefully we've really served to advance the technology. But essentially what happens is if it is not a discrete event where you have, let's say, an odor being perpetuated by a facility and then it's over, that's easy. They can get a notice of violation and tell you what happened and you assess a penalty. If it's something ongoing, we file a petition for an order for abatement with our hearing board, and that's essentially an administrative injunction. It says shut down entirely or comply with the following operating conditions. And that is why Sunshine Canyon went on for so long. It was a very complicated problem. We knew we couldn't shut down the landfill. That was just simply not an option. There was no other place for all that trash to go. And believe me, we looked to see if we could divert a substantial amount of it, all of it, a little bit. There was really no place else for all that trash to go. So we had to devise means by which we thought we could reduce the odors progressively as they made repairs and improvements at the landfill. And some of the things we tried didn't work. And some of the things that were tried made things worse. So it was a real learning curve, and it just went on and on and on until we finally got the right people involved and the right technologies involved. And that is probably one of the worst nuisance cases that we've ever dealt with, only in terms of it being so complex and difficult to resolve. We've had other cases involving dead cows that were left literally outside of the Farmer John facility, I think, days gone by. And the gas leak at Aliso Canyon, which was clearly, in terms of public health impacts, far worse than anything occurring at Sunshine Canyon, but was a discrete incident. And and they were put under an order for abatement because it kept going, and we didn't know how to stop it. So they were under an order for abatement to monitor and notify the public and take all kinds of other corrective actions that we could think of to mitigate the harm while they were trying to shut down that well. Yes, Paul.
One of the scenarios that I have right now, is on Alameda and the 70th Street, 78th, that general area, the little finger of South Central, but the industrial side. We had all those old junkyards there in the early part of the 1900s, and they were, and that technology in those days, they got the oil tanks and just stuck them in the ground.
Yeah.
And then put a little top on them, and then they took oil out of it. Well, 40, 50 years later, the metal disintegrated, and the actual dirt is black. And you can see the steam coming out of, the odor coming out of the dirt. And there's about 10 yards left, because some of them have been regutted, but they're still there, and you can smell it. I mean, it's not powerful, but once you get on the facility, you can't, because you got old parts, and they're still selling. The businesses are going, they're selling car parts and all the usual things that they do over there. So eventually, if they don't clean them up, I think AQMD is going to get involved in that, but that's something that can't be grandfathered in, and the dirt is just, it's contaminated. You can't, and they can't sell the business either, because there's not a title company that'll do title on something like that and insure it. So what's the alternative to something like that?
Yeah, that for us, in terms of our jurisdiction, it's going to depend if the odors become strong enough, how many people are impacted and complain. Is it a public nuisance or not? And if it's not, then it's generally a problem for DTSC, because it's going to be a soil remediation problem, not an air quality problem. But we are finding that there are areas now, because of the history of the area and the sorts of businesses that used to be conducted in certain places in the oil fields, where you have such contaminated soil and real estate is, such a prime commodity, that people are coming in despite
the contaminated soil, and they want to develop an area. So we have a problem now in Orange County. Where they're developing a property and they know they have to clean up the soil. They know it's going to take them months to do it. And in the meantime, they're generating so much odor that the neighborhood is just up in arms about it. So we are being very much involved in how that particular situation is going to be addressed.
I'm curious. I know which situation you're talking about.
Yeah.
I've seen some interactions since I'm in that city. But that's a good example of you have DTSC and South Coast.
Yes.
How do you interact with DTSC with that type of situation?
We, fortunately, we interact pretty well with DTSC. I think we've always had a generally good relationship with our sister regulators. And I think with DTSC in particular, after Exide, we became such a team that we now know who to call. They know who to call here. So there's a lot of good communication between the agencies, and we know our jurisdictions and our parts. And believe me, the public is making it abundantly clear to all of us that we have to work together effectively to address all their concerns in cases like this. Anything else? Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Nancy. Both the governing board member Benoit and Derek had to leave early, so you're stuck with me. My apologies. But moving right along.
Subject. Is there anyone who has a comment? I think. Does anyone have any questions? Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to go to public comment. Thank you. Okay, so written report is attached, attachment number 5 on small business assistant activities. Any questions on that? If not, we'll move to other matters. Is there any other business?
I just had one question. I didn't mean to walk all over John. Your dry cleaning fund, is there any money left in that?
I believe there is. I can double check that with you and have Ricardo get back to you on that. Okay.
And is it designated, like hydrocarbon machines or wet cleaning or?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
And is it just a fund for non-perk machines, or is that broken down into hydrocarbon, CO2 types of
I don't know that. We'll find that out for you.
Maybe for the next meeting.
Sure. I'll have him give you a call, and then you can ask all your questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Good.
What next meeting too? Also, not today, obviously. Will we do something on cap and trade down the road?
Sure.
Like an explanation of it?
Sure.
Not right now, but that's coming around the corner.
Sure it is.
Especially with elections coming around the corner.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure. We'll put that on the agenda. Mm-hmm.
I'm just looking at your report, excuse me. What's the balance of permits that have not been, or not in process or were behind? Is that on this report? I was looking on it and I didn't see.
The balance of, I'm sorry.
Permits outstanding.
Oh, on the permit. Oh, yeah, Lockie had given a report on that. That's in the permitting department. John, I'll have to get that information for you, John, and
Can we get that
back to
next
you.
time?
Sure.
John?
Yes.
Excuse me to butt in, but there's a permit streamlining committee meeting on June 27th.
Thank you.
Well, I just wanted to,
I'll get that
I know you went
information.
the electronic thing, and I thought, is that taking a bite out of that backlog?
Sure, it has definitely taken a bite, but of course the permit applications are still coming in, but I'll get that number for you.
Okay, thank you.
John, you could look online. I think permit streamlining page on the website has a summary of the decrease. I believe so.
Oh, that's good to know, as Nancy said. It's very manageable. They've done an outstanding job with cutting into that backlog. It's been a continuing thing, I know, for the past 2 years. Mm-hmm. They've done an outstanding job. I don't know about that. We don't want him to stop or slow down. Is there any other business? Is there any public comment on any of the items that we've had, that we've discussed? Okay, no public comment. Our next meeting date is Friday, July the 19th at 11:30. We will talk about, I'll talk to the chair about having the cap and trade on the agenda. And I'll get that information to you, John, okay? And with that having been said, if there's no other questions or comments, we will adjourn. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Nancy, for your comprehensive presentation.